Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this meeting of the Borough Plan Committee. We do have some guests with us tonight, so I will go through the evacuation procedure, even though all of you know it. So a fire drill is not expected. If the alarm sounds, please evacuate the building quickly and calmly using the stairs if you go out either of these doors to the main stairs, out of the front door, and we assemble across the road outside of the Virgin Money building. It's a good time to remind you to turn your phones onto silent or switch them off. Apologies. I have two apologies. Councillor Brown, who's being substituted by Councillor Markham. Welcome, Councillor Markham. And Councillor Svetkovic, who's being substituted by Councillor Harbison. Welcome. Minutes of the last meeting. I guess you'll all have had a chance to read them. I'll propose the minutes. Do I have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Kenner. Can we have a show of hands to approve them? Thank you. I'll sign those off. Pass those over to... Oh, there's a paper there of mine, if I can have it back. Lovely, thank you. Right, item 4, have we any declarations of interest? No, I see none. Okay. Public consultation, I've not been advised of any. No members of the public here. So we can move on to the main item, item 6, and if I can ask Ashley to do a quick introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So, members of the committee, the purpose of this report is effectively to request that the appendix within the report, the design code, gets taken forward as a supplementary planning document. And we've asked our colleagues from PRP Architects to give a detailed presentation on that draft document and the process we went through in preparing it. Before we do that, just to give a bit of context as to why we've arisen at this opportunity. So government last calendar year made clear that they wanted to see improvements in design through the planning process. And I think there was a clear recognition that some of the applications coming forward were not of a standard that was necessarily palatable for local communities, and also presented planning committees with difficult decisions and a lack of ability to sort of effectively push back on poor design. So one of the tools that has been considered is design coding, and it's all around the theme of sort of building beautiful, which I'm sure members will be sort of familiar with in terms of what came out in previous white papers. So towards, I think it was sort of around this time last year, the opportunity to bid to be part of a pilot status was issued by government. And we decided in consultation with both parties that we would submit an application for pilot status. And we were lucky enough to get that award, so we were one of the 14 authorities to be part of the round 1 pilots. Now, under the terms of the award, we were in receipt of £50,000, which was there to help all those authorities do the testing. And it was up to each authority to decide how they spent that money. But there was a recognition that for each authority, there's going to be a resource implication in doing design coding, hence the £50,000 award. We decided that based on our resources and expertise within the authority, that we would instruct PRP to be our lead architects. That make clear to members that didn't use all of the 50,000. We did also issue some additional instructions around consultation and to Coventry City Council to get some critical friend support. They have an urban design team in-house. So effectively that's how we utilise that £50,000. Now PRP effectively led the development of the code, and I won't sort of tread on their toes now, that they'll go through that in detail during the presentation. Officer input was predominantly from myself at this authority, and we had weekly meetings and regular updates as per part of preparing the code, and there was other officers involved throughout the council. Now what we had to do was work to quite a tight time scale, and what I would say is, on reflection, that was probably too tight, the time scale that we had to work to. Effectively, we had to submit the code by the end of September. So I think in terms of our learning as an authority, that's something we'll need to think about if this is something we want to take forward. We have done some additional work since the submission to the ministry, and that is reflected within the Appendix A. Now really it's up to the authority to determine what we do with this work, hence the recommendation that we take it forward. So the code that's been developed relates specifically to the Arbury strategic allocation. That's in the plan, and my colleagues at PRP go through that in a bit more detail. Now we selected that because effectively that site hadn't been built out, so it represented an opportunity to us. And really the question to members now is, do we want to apply this code and take it further, or do we just want to accept it as a good piece of work and sort of a lessons learned? The recommendation from us is that we do take it forward and actually consult on the code, and that effectively would give it weight if we do come round to adopt it. I'll pass over to my colleagues at PRP to deliver their presentation now. That's going to be around half an hour. There's then opportunity for Q&A to PRP, and then it'll be back to the chair for any further questions in terms of that you might have towards how we might want to approach things. But I'll pass over to my colleagues, Rupini and Kieran from PRP. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Ashley. Are we on? Yeah? Great, thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Chair. Nice to be here tonight. Thank you for inviting us along. Just building what Ashley said, we're going to take you through in a bit more detail the design code which has been produced for the Arbury site. Okay, so picking up on what Ashley said there, the blue box at the top, as he said, this site was allocated as part of the borough plan adopted in 2019. Following that, there was a SPD document for what's known as the HSG2 Arbury site. And then as you come down to the yellow box, that is what we produced as part of the National Model Design Code programme. So a draft design code which has now been updated slightly following a bit of further consultation with some of the officers, highways officers, etc. And where we are now is at the stage of preparing to adopt the design code if we wish to do so. Following this, any plan applications that come forward on the site would or could be subject to further design codes, so more detailed design codes. To be clear, that the design code we produced is fairly high level, and there is scope for, as I say, more detailed design codes to come forward with plan applications. And then obviously after that, there'd be construction work on site. So what did we produce as part of the National Model Design Code pilot scheme? Well, firstly, the Arbury Design Code. Adjoining that was an engagement report, which was a separate document, and also an analysis and testing report, which pretty much tests the parameters and principles which we set within the design code itself, but that very much does sit separately to the main design code document, which is what we're discussing tonight. So what is a design code? So in short, it's a sort of simple set of concise design requirements for a site, which sets parameters and principles for that site for then designers to come in and design it out in detail. It's a tool available for local planning authorities, communities and developers to define and deliver design quality, which kind of picks up on what Ashley was talking about, and that's kind of why the National Model Design Code was set out. They're important because they provide a framework for creating healthier, greener, environmentally responsive, sustainable and distinctive places, and again instilling that high quality and good standard of design. And also they can create or provide a great level of certainty for the communities, so it gives them some certainty that good quality development will come forward. And the kind of things you might find within a design code, it could involve street layouts, open spaces, landscaping approaches onto built form, so proportions of buildings, building heights, that kind of thing. Also environmental performance is quite a big thing which we've included in the design code. And also character, so developing or building on local vernacular, local heritage, historical items, that kind of thing. Okay, so moving on to the site, as Ashley spoke about earlier, the HSG2 site, known as Arbury, as we know, it's within Warwickshire in Nuneaton, Bedworth Borough. It sits to the southwest of the town here, next to Ensall's Pool, and it's part of the Arbury estate. It's an 86-hectare site, so it's fairly sizable, and it forms part of a greenbelt release. And that kind of forms part of the strategic allocation. So to the north there, I think if we move on to the next slide. Yeah, so to the north there's some residential development. There's a school up there. And as I say, over to the east there's Ensall's Pool. To the south and west it's very much woodland, some protected land as well. On site itself is mainly arable farmland. You might be able to see to the bottom right there, the southeast corner, there's some industrial uses. But as I say, mainly it's arable farmland at the moment. So during the early stages of the design code development, we hosted a lot of engagement, and that was kind of fit into three streams. So it's internal officers and members, including officers from highways, affordable housing, parks and open spaces, infrastructure, social care, elected members, of course, and development control within the Borough Council. External, so the landowner themselves, it's a single landowner, and we met with those on more than one occasion to discuss our plans and also to understand what they wanted from the process. We also met with Woodlands Trust and the Ramblers Association, who gave us some really interesting comments and some useful pointers when we're developing the design code. And of course, the wider community. So we held public engagement events, and we also included some school engagement programs. So we hosted events at Stockingford Academy Primary School. So we met with 3 different year groups there, which was really engaging, really interesting. They were really chatty and welcoming, and we had some good tasks for those. And then Nuneaton Academy Secondary School, again, we met with 2 or 3 year groups from there and got lots and lots of comments from those, which were filtered down and were put into the design code. So they gave plenty of good ideas, and it was a really beneficial couple of days there spent at the schools. So as well as the 3 groups of parties we were involved in, we kind of did 3 stages of engagement. So initial engagement, which was in the early part of the process, June and July, that's where we gathered initial ideas from those 3 parties and kind of got their thoughts on the local area, what they wanted to see from the local area, some of their aspirations. We then progressed onto stage 2. So this is when we had a draft of the design code itself. We went back to officers internally and discussed what we had written as part and designed as part of the design code. We then got further feedback from those guys and updated the design code where necessary. That brought us up to the submission to MHCLG, and beyond that, so kind of where we have been the past month or so, is further engagement. So that's where we've continued to engage with some of those officers, in particular highways officers, just to tweak certain elements of the design code. So further consultation with those guys, basically. And we're now arrived at the document we have today, which is ready for adoption. So the structure of the design code, a bit of introductory stuff to start with, and then some context. So kind of like what I was showing you earlier, a bit of information about the local area and the site itself. And design code is split into 4 sections. So open space and nature, movement and connectivity, and then built form, and finally a character narrative, which, as I say, builds on some of that historical element and the local character. Beyond that, there's some other matters which I'll talk about in a bit more detail later. So that kind of, the blue boxes there just indicate some of the items which fell within those main categories. And then, as I touched on earlier, the other section there, so the engagement report and the analysis and testing report sat very much outside the design code. So that analysis and testing report included some detailed site-specific analysis, what's called an area types worksheet, which covers the whole of Nuneaton and Bedworth and was very much part of the National Model Design Code, and then a concept master plan. So it's important to highlight that what we have done as part of the design code does not include any kind of master plan. It's purely setting parameters and principles at a high level. So what we're not doing is drawing on the site and drawing parcels of land, parcels of open space, roads, etc. That is not included as part of the design code. We did it as a supplementary exercise, which is purely testing those principles which we set out in terms of density and ensuring we're providing the correct open spaces, etc. But as I say, it was not included and is not included as part of the design code itself. So in terms of the draft design code itself, the next few slides, we've extracted some pages from it. So we're quite keen to show you some of the elements that feature within it. So open spaces and nature section. This particular slide shows some of the green network corridors. So there's 4 different types of green network corridors as part of design code. This shows 2 of them. And basically what we're showing in section here is the correct widths that you should apply to footpaths, cycle paths, and then verges either side. And then of course the green network corridor itself and the widths that they have to be. So on the left here, a neighbourhood path and neighbourhood green network corridor, which is forms a slightly narrower path and corridor than the one to the right, which is a strategic green network corridor, which has a minimum of 30 metres for the corridor itself. And again, there's the other 2 types of corridor within the document itself as well. Another part of the open space and nature section is allotments. So on the right-hand side, you will see in purple there allotments both on the site and externally. And in the blue box on the left is where we have mandatory components of the design code. So within the design code itself, there are some elements which are advisory and others which are mandatory. So advisory elements are kind of, as they sound, they're very much advising any designers or developers coming forward that this is what you should be aspiring to achieve. Whereas the mandatory, you would have to achieve that. So for example, the first point there, provision on site, minimum 20 new allotment plots per 1,000 homes. So that is something a developer would have to look at and have to react to. So again, there's further points on there regarding sort of fencing off allotment spaces, and kind of gradients, etc. So it just provides some basis for designers to come forward and design out allotment spaces for. But again, with the map there, we're not specifying where these allotment spaces may be. That's purely factual information about where they are at the moment, and then a designer would need to interpret that alongside the mandatory and advisory guidance, and then design thereafter. Again, so with trees, the diagram on the right, trees and hedgerows, sorry, on the right-hand side, you've got a diagram showing where any existing isolated trees are, and then where any hedgerows are as well on site. So the main point here is we're trying to retain those as much as possible. However, at some point they may have to break if you're putting a strategic road through there, for example. And what we've tried to do in this section is just ensure they're maintained where possible, but also providing some guidance where if you do have to break them, it's minimal effect on the habitat, etc. So again, you've got that nice blue box there, which is the mandatory guidance, and the points below, the bullet points below in the white area would be advisory. So in the built form section, we started to indicate how street relationships and block forms might arrive on site. So this is very much illustrative, and it's just an example of when we're talking about particular types of parking, so mews parking or enclosed private spaces, what that may look like. So this by no means, we haven't designed the site out. This is just purely and indicatively showing what it could look like, just to give that visual element, which is a very key part of the design code and as part of the National Model Design Code as well. As I mentioned earlier, it's very much illustrative, so that's what we're trying to show here. Building frontages onto the streets, kind of flat roofs, pitched roofs, etc., gable ends. That's kind of getting across the points we're trying to make as part of the guidance. And again, so the previous image was in 3D. This one's more in plan, and this talks about the type of block formations which we might have. This one in particular is a back-to-back block. So this is where we're talking about all residential units being back-to-back and forming those nice private gardens. We have some advisory bullet points on the right talking about parking, the gardens, talking about strong building frontages, that kind of thing. And again, that these kind of images flow through the document. There's different types of block formations which we have in there, and again, purely showing indicatively what we mean. So if a developer or designer was to come forward in the future and propose a back-to-back block, this is the kind of thing we would expect to see from that. But yeah, it's no way designing out the Arbory site itself, it's just forming those principles and parameters. Types of homes again, so part of the built form section, we've indicated some rough kind of proportions for buildings, what you might expect to see kind of from a detached house. I think the next is a terraced house as well, so we've got different types of guidance for detached, semi-detached apartments, etc. And again, you've got that blue box there which very clearly shows what those mandatory elements are, and then surrounding that would be some advisory. We also introduce images throughout the document, both of local architecture. Well, in fact, images flow throughout the whole document. So whether it's streets, we're talking about open spaces, built form. We have example images from the Nuneaton Bedworth area, and also some more examples of either schemes which PRB have designed ourselves, or other exemplary schemes from either the local area or wider across England. And they really just help to illustrate the points we're making within the guidance. So again, the top two images there, local schemes, Gadsby Street and Nuneaton, and then below you've got a couple of ideas from Cambridge which show some of the ideas which we're developing within that mandatory and advisory guidance. Movement and connectivity. So a lot of this section is talking about street dimensions and kind of road widths. This is where we had quite extensive consultation with highways officers, and obviously all this draws back to highways guidance, both locally and nationally. So a lot of this section talks about primary streets, secondary streets, tertiary streets, and then other streets, which would be more kind of access roads. And what we try to do here is just present exactly what we want to see from designs coming forward. So as you can see, the carriageway widths there are quite specific, 6.7 to 7.3 metres. If we go on to the next page, this kind of indicates the specific dimensions and specific street furniture, speed limits, etc., which you might see on those streets. So while it's not indicating where these streets should be formed as such, it very much suggests the hierarchy and suggests what we should expect to see within those streets. For example, primary streets and secondary streets may have public transport functions, whereas the tertiary streets would not. So you'll see in this, we don't have it on this slide, but if you're looking at a tertiary street as part of this, later in the document there's a table for tertiary streets, and they wouldn't have a bus route down, for example, so that would be a straight no. And given the blue colouring of the table, it's mandatory. So if you're going to propose a tertiary street, you cannot have a bus route down there, for example. Other parts of the movement and connectivity section talk about kind of some mandatory coding about landscaping, also kind of principles. So we've got some images there to support what we're talking about in terms of diversity of street trees, and also kind of street plantings, etc. Street lighting is also a key element of it. So here we have an indication of what we mean by tertiary street, and immediately you can see from the diagram it's a lot narrower than what the primary street was. There's parking on here, which on the primary street there would not be, and it just gives a little bit of a flavour of what those streets might look like, as well as giving on this particular page some advisory guidance, and there's also mandatory guidance which comes along with this. So just trying to build in that character, make sure that there's some nice features as part of that street, so optional grass verge and street trees, etc., to try and build in that character and quality and places where people like to live. As well as part of the movement and connectivity section, we talk about car parking. The car parking section is very much expanded, where we talk about on-plot parking, garageway parking, on-street parking. There's several diagrams in terms of that. It also references the Transport Demand Management Matters, SPD. Talk briefly about parking space sizes. Again, these are drawn down from local and national policy, accessible parking, and also electrical vehicle parking, which is obviously becoming more and more prevalent at the moment. So the character narrative section, what you may see if there's a master plan, for example, is actually areas of a site sectioned off. So the north-west section may be a certain character, north-east may be another one. What we've tried to do here, because it's very high level, is purely indicate what kind of characters we may see across the site. But what we're not doing is specifying where those character areas may be located on the site, which again doesn't restrict designers coming forward in the future. It just gives a bit of a flavour of what we want to see from designs in the future. So picking up on one of those points, so industrial heritage, we've got some images locally of the kind of mining that's been around the area, and some kind of material palettes which may form part of an industrial heritage. But again, it's very much advisory at this stage, with some mandatory principles in there. You'll see the little blue box there, but it's just guiding developers in the future, just to try and instill some of that local character and heritage to the Arbury site. Again, the urban core, so there's a bit of inspiration down there, local streets, terraces, that kind of thing, which we have seen in the local area. So drawing upon that, drawing upon the material palette, and the kind of identity of those historic streets, so terraces, 2 stories, pitched roof, that kind of thing, and some of the proportions which you may expect to see. And these kind of diagrams and tables, material palettes form the whole character narrative section. So each of those 5 or 6 character areas will have those reflective images, some ideas for materials, and some mandatory and advisory guidance that come along with them. And finally, as part of the other matters within the design code, there's a compliance checklist. So a compliance checklist is what a developer or designer will need to complete in the future. So when the landowner sells off a parcel of the land and it gets designed out in detail, that developer and or their designer will have to complete this. This is an extract, but it's quite a long statement, and it just ensures that what they've done complies with the principles and parameters set out within the design code. It's kind of acts as a bit of a safeguarding. So the design code, needs to be used, and they'll go through, and where proposals do not meet parts of the design code, they may have a warranted justification, or they may have just not met them. So this is designed to kind of highlight where those gaps may be, and if there are gaps, if they haven't met parts of the design code, why they haven't, and if it's fully justified. This also can act as a bit of a tool for people assessing applications coming forward. So they will, you can look at this and just check whether those different sections have been met. Developers may also include a compliance statement as part of any sort of design and access statement that comes forward. So that will sit separately to this design coding exercise, but again, it just ensures that they're meeting the principles and parameters set out within this design code. And that's it. So a bit of a brief overview of some of the elements of the design code. So thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Kieran. A really good overview. The actual document that goes along with this is massive. So I think that was quite a precise overview of what it's all about. So we can debate and run a Q&A session on that. I'd like to propose the recommendation so that the committee endorses the development of a supplementary planning document associated with the draft design code for Arbory strategic allocation, and for the committee to note the outputs arising from the pilot project and consider the application of the National Model Design Code as part of the future local policy framework. So I'll propose that. Can I have a seconder? Thank you. Councillor Walsh. So open to members now, Q&A and questions. Councillor Tromans.
Actually, Chair, I think we need to recognise that this is a government trial, and we were very lucky to get it. Again, we've managed to get a fair bit of money out of the government for Nuneaton and the borough generally. So a really good learning experience for us, for officers, for everybody involved. This has obviously got to be the way forward, because it will, and I can imagine the reserve of residents when they're being faced with this, but actually this will enable those places that have already been determined as sites to be built on. It will enable the local communities to have more of a say in what happens in there. There'll be hopefully better built, better designed developments, and there'll be more of use in meeting the needs of local people, not some national targets or whatever. So, and given the tight timeframes that we've heard about, I think we ought to thank officers for pulling out all the stops for that and making it happen. And I think the thing I heard out of all of that really cheered me up was the way that we'd reached out to a particular skill set in a neighbouring local authority to get that critical friend advice from a really good team that's in a larger authority that's got that facility there. And so credit to everyone for doing that, and thanks to the team there at Coventry for assisting with it. It's very tempting to look at what's been put up there and say, oh, look at what the consultants have drawn on there, and oh, that doesn't look right to me, and what about this, and what about that? But I think we're getting ahead of the game. That's to come when the applications come in. That's for not us to bear the cost of, but developers, because at the end of the day, they're going to make enough money out of this. We don't need to be helping them any. We need to give them the guidance, and we need to give them the criteria, and we need to know that has got the weight of law behind it and is very best practice. And that's what the government's funded us to do. And so obviously anything that comes in now that steps outside of what we're talking about here, we're on a really strong position to say, no, that won't work for residents, that won't work for the borough, I'm sorry, you'll have to think again. So we've got best practice put down here on paper, it seems, and that's all really good. And as I say, I think we could spend all night just talking about what about this, and well, what about putting the allotment there, and you showed us the back-to-backs, but what does that... I think we have to wait till the applications come in. But I did want to put on record that we should, it's great that the government's given us this money. It was a real opportunity. And B, thank the officers for everything they've done. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I couldn't agree with you more. Bit of a coup us getting this £50,000 to run this in the first place, but a brilliant job delivered by not only the consultants, but also our in-house team and all those that help. And I think it'll give communities, as these new developments come forward, it'll give communities a real say in what they look like and a sense of place and a nod to our heritage. So I think it's a fantastic piece of work. Councillor Kenner.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for that presentation. It was I really enjoyed it, actually. I particularly like the parts about keeping in tune with local heritage and the local history, because I think that's lost on a lot of new developments. I've got a couple of points, most of them probably yes or no answers, but it's just take them one at a time if that's all right, because they tend to dart all over the place. The first one was just about the allotment section, as I've got quite a large allotment allocation in my area, and so I know how important they are. And it was just on the parts about the mandatory and the advisory sections. So, 'cause remember you mentioned in your presentation that the location of the allotments wasn't mandatory. You weren't telling developers where to put them, but also in the mandatory box up on the screen, it says they must be adjoining the Atoll Crescent allotments. I was just wondering if they are, in fact, if the location of them is, in fact, mandatory, or it will be up to developers in the future where they put them. That's point one. If you want to answer that, I'll let you come in.
Thank you. Yeah, so you would have seen that on the table, and that you're completely correct. The thing with the allotments is so I think per 1,000 homes there's a certain allocation of allotments which you must have. I think it was 20. Given this site is allocated 1,500 homes, approximately, it's about 30 or so allotments. There is some guidance externally which references that there should, when you design allotment space, there should be a minimum number. So in that respect, the site is somewhat constrained. I think the allotment spaces will be joined on to the existing because the site isn't big enough to have two separate allotment spaces, if that makes sense. Yeah. So does that kind of answer your question?
Thanks, Chair. So the other bit was I looked up at the wrong time just as something darted off the screen. It's about electric vehicle charging points, because I represent a very, very built up and terraced ward, and introducing electric charging points has been quite difficult. But I saw that there was something like you have to have one electric charging point per every allocated parking space and one for every 10 unallocated. So when you say unallocated, is that like roadside parking? Is that so you're going to have one charging point to service a particular section of the roads that people electric vehicles can use? And also I missed whether that's mandatory or whether that's optional as well.
I may have to look through the design code itself. I may have to get back to you on the specifics of that. I can't quite recall. In terms of allocated spaces, that would be sort of visitor or just non-allocated, not allocated to a specific household. But yeah, I think it's great that we're introducing that kind of thing. It's going to be more, they're going to be much more used in the future as we move forward. And obviously that needs to be in line with national policy, which it very much references.
Just on the checklist, what thing you mentioned at the very end, is that mandatory for all applications going forward? Yes, and as well, will that apply sort of in the future? Does this design code just apply to the Arbury allocation while it's HSG2, or will that apply to someone who owns a property in 50 years who needs a planning application going through? Will this code still apply in 50, 75 years' time if it doesn't get repealed or anything in the meantime? Thank you.
So Ashley may want to jump in on this one. The mandatory coding checklist is exactly that, it's mandatory. So at this stage, any developer coming forward would need to complete that checklist and also complete their own compliance statement, which, as I said, would probably fit into their design access statement, so it'd be part of their planning pack. So it kind of acts to make sure the developer is looking at design code and using it, but it also acts as a bit of a checklist for people assessing it, and also members of the community who want to have a look through here. It just simplifies or condenses the design code document itself into a simple checklist where they can say, how does this application meet the built form? Does it meet the building heights parameters? And it's an easy sort of go-to. In terms of the extension, or how far in the future this will be used, maybe Ashley wants to jump in on that if possible.
Thank you, Kieran. So in terms of how long it will last, assuming it gets through to adoption, so we'll have to consult on the code as an SPD, and then it'll have to go through to the council to adoption. Assuming that takes place, it would effectively stay in place until it's superseded. So that would either be the authority decide that actually we want to update the SPD, and then you'd have to consider that checklist, or through the plan review. So as part of the plan review, we've got to review all of those policies. Now, assuming that allocation remains, it's likely that it would roll forward, but we have to go through a process. But effectively, it stays in place until we supersede it as an authority. In terms of the question on car parking, it's on page 55 of the Appendix A. Which identifies what's mandatory in terms of those EV points. But from what I've just read, that is mandatory.
That's it. Thank you. Councillor Walmsley.
Thanks, Chair. Just building on what Councillor Kenneth said, and I think was perhaps part more of his question, was I think if effectively once presume this was adopted, full through, became council policy, an application came in for the site, it was built, it was developed, it was all adopted by the various authorities or whatever 106 agreements are in place for private management of the estate. It was all built, all done, the developer had packed off his spade and gone home. Would then these elements still apply to Doris, who wanted to put an extension on her home? Or actually are these then carried out at the point of the building and the developer packing up his bucket and spade effectively? I think that's perhaps more the question that Councillor Kenner was sort of drawing to. Would this potentially stop Doris building an extra garage on the site because it would potentially change the sight lines? Or would it stop her potentially would it restrict a permitted development rights by elements of building within the roof, for example, changing the height of floors? I think it's that kind of element is what I'd be interested to know, and I think was perhaps part of the angle at what Councillor Kenner was driving at as well. Does this just apply to the developer until it's built, or would it all apply to the developer, and then when, I say, Doris owned the home, it all still applies to her as well.
Okay, thanks, Councillor. I think it's a really good question, and I think ultimately we are, as the English planning system, just testing this out. So to some extent, that's quite hard to answer, and ultimately we'll need to give some consideration as to actually how we embed these codes. So, you know, is it when we get down to the sort of reserve matter stage, are we going to be conditioning the application so there's sort of effectively these restrictions in place? My understanding is that it isn't really in the spirit to be penalising your kind of end users so they can't do anything. We'll obviously have to give some thought as to how we kind of find that balance. Certainly in here we're not sort of looking to remove permitted development rights and sort of issue Article 4s. So that should give you end users the ability to work within the sort of national framework that does exist. I think the reality is we'll probably end up with lots of case law in sort of 5-10 years that sort of deal with that. But it's a good point.
Yes, thank you. Any other speakers on this? Councillor Walsh.
Just a quick question. I'm assuming that this gives us better control over what developers are producing in terms of their housing. A little bit similar to what Councillor Walmsley just said. Does this apply to single build or multiple build, or what would be the situation there?
So this code is specifically targeted at the Arbury estate, and the expectation is that they will submit an outline application of a significant scale. So that's really its target audience. Now, we could be in a situation where they put an application forward for 5 dwellings or something very small. I think that's unlikely. If they do, then technically, if this is in place, the code would apply. But really, this code is more of a strategic code to operate at a higher level. The system that's been created does enable the authority to look at codes on a finite level. And if you were looking at a small development, say 5-10 dwellings, the reality is the code would be much more detailed for it to be meaningful. Hopefully that answers your question.
Well, in fact, an auxiliary question based on the same thing. Given if we adopt this code plan, does that mean that there is a greater work to be done by the officers when a planning application is made?
Ultimately, we don't know because we've not tested coding out at the application stage. Now, it shouldn't be that shouldn't be the end result. Ultimately, the purpose of coding is meant to help officers, because effectively it should be giving you, if you're a case officer, you've got a framework here to use to effectively assess what is good design for your application. Whereas at the minute, in simple terms, you could say, well, there isn't a framework, so we just do it via dialogue back and forth, and then we end up at committee, and committee in a position where they're effectively reliant on the officers sort of saying, well, this is in line with national policy. So it shouldn't be. I mean, ultimately, there will be additional documentation submitted, but that should be there to help officers, but we'll have to obviously test it out as we sort of receive applications.
Councillor Markham.
Yeah, it's just a question really. If we do adopt a code, not necessarily this one, but any code, will it apply just to the new builds coming in, or if we've got an application that's been accepted in principle, but the plans haven't arrived yet, will it still apply to those, or will that be, it won't?
So, thank you, Councillor. So, we could develop a code on a site that has outline permission. What this recommends is actually the developer brings code in forward through conditions. So you could do codes on reserved matters. Ultimately, it's going to depend what you've agreed at that outline stage. And if you are then doing something at reserved matter stage, it is going to be much more detailed. I think the reality is we're going to have to work with the development industry because these are incredibly resource intensive, and even for authorities where they've got the expertise at Coventry, I just can't envisage how they would be developing lots of codes across the city. But yeah, you can do it at a later stage. There's opportunity for that.
Thank you. Any other member? No? Oh, Councillor Walmsley.
Thank you, Chair. It's a slightly broader question of, I understand this obviously is a pilot. Would there be anything stopping us doing obviously beyond the finances, would there be anything that stop us doing another one on another HS strategic allocation if we so wished within our borough? Or is this only permissible under law as a pilot scheme? If that makes sense. So I know we're being funded by the government for this pilot, which is obviously what we're considering tonight, but more broadly, could we, if we wanted tomorrow, create a strategic housing allocation policy for another piece of land, within the borough plan?
As it stands, this pilot only applies to Arbury, but there's nothing stopping us from doing another piece of work on other allocated sites as they come forward. Obviously, with this as a basis, it gives us a pretty good starting block to move forward and quickly produce something else, maybe without the intensity of work that this first one has needed. So yeah, absolutely. Any other member? No. So we've had the recommendation proposed and seconded, so we'll just go to a show of hands. All in favour? That's unanimous, thank you very much. Right, we have no other items on the agenda, so I can close the meeting at that. Thank you very much for your attendance. Thank you for our guests. And Chris, if we can turn off the live streaming, please.
Thank you, Chair.